Ghastly Garlic, Episode 9. Shadows of the Mind, Chapter 1. The First Murder. Detective Lucas Monroe stared out of the precinct window, his sharp blue eyes tracking the slow descent of autumn leaves, swirling in the crisp New York City air. The chill in the air signified the nearing end of autumn, but Monroe barely felt it. He was lost in thought, reflecting on the complexities of his latest case. At 42, Lucas Monroe was one of the NYPD's most seasoned detectives. His career spanned 2 decades, a timeline marked with high-profile cases that had tested his mettle and honed his instincts to a razor edge. He had a reputation for cracking cases that seemed unsolvable, a legacy built on a mix of intuition, dogged determination, and a touch of unspoken empathy for the victims. Monroe's face, rugged and weathered, bore the scars of a career spent chasing shadows through the city's underbelly. His sandy blonde hair was starting to grey at the temples, a testament to years of stress and sleepless nights. Yet his posture remained that of a man in his prime, upright, alert, and always ready. Today he wore his usual attire, a worn leather jacket over a crisp white shirt, dark jeans, and sturdy boots, a blend of formality and practicality that matched his dual roles as a street detective and an investigator. The city outside was alive with the usual cacophony of sounds. Honking cabs, distant sirens, the murmur of countless conversations blending into an urban symphony. Central Park, usually a haven of green amidst the concrete, was now a tapestry of orange, red, and gold. The trees stood bare in parts, their branches clawing at the overcast sky like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth and the distant promise of winter. As Monroe turned away from the window, he felt a vibration from his pocket. Pulling out his phone, he saw a message from his partner, Detective Sarah Mitchell. "Meet me at Central Park. We have a body." The crime scene was a secluded alleyway near the Bethesda Fountain, a place that was usually bustling with tourists and joggers, but now stood eerily quiet. Yellow police tape cordoned off the area, and uniformed officers kept curious onlookers at bay. As Monroe approached, he saw Sarah waiting for him, her face a mask of professional detachment. Sarah Mitchell was in her early 30s, with a sharp mind and a fierce dedication to her work that had quickly earned her a place at Monroe's side. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and her eyes, dark and perceptive, scanned the scene with a keen intensity. She wore a tailored suit, practical yet elegant, with a badge clipped to her belt and a gun holstered at her hip. Monroe nodded at her, and they ducked under the tape together, their breath visible in the chilly air. The body lay crumpled against the stone wall of the alley, partially hidden by a pile of fallen leaves. The victim was a young woman, her lifeless eyes staring blankly at the sky. She wore a simple dress, now stained with dirt and blood, and one shoe was missing, lying a few feet away as if it had been kicked off in a struggle. Monroe knelt beside the body, his eyes scanning the scene with practiced precision. "What do we have?" he asked, glancing up at Sarah. "Victim is a Jane Doe for now," Sarah replied, flipping through her notebook. "No ID, no phone. Found by a jogger about an hour ago. Medical examiners on the way." Monroe nodded, leaning closer to examine the body. There were no obvious signs of trauma aside from a thin red line around her neck. "Strangled," he murmured, noting the bruising that indicated a struggle. "Killer must have used a garrote or something similar. Check for fibers or any other trace evidence." Sarah nodded, already directing the forensic team to take samples from the area. Monroe stood up, his eyes sweeping the alley for any additional clues. The ground was muddy, and there were faint footprints leading into the alley, but none leaving it, suggesting the killer had taken care to cover their tracks. Monroe turned his attention to the walls of the alley, looking for any graffiti or markings that might indicate a gang-related crime, but found nothing. His eyes then caught a glint of something metallic partially buried in the leaves. He carefully retrieved it with a gloved hand. It was a small silver pendant, likely torn from the victim during the struggle. While the forensic team continued their work, Monroe and Sarah began canvassing the area for witnesses. The jogger who had found the body, a middle-aged man in a tracksuit, was still at the scene, visibly shaken. Monroe approached him with a reassuring smile. "I'm Detective Monroe, and this is Detective Mitchell. We understand you found the body. Can you tell us exactly what you saw?" The jogger took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "I was running my usual route, around 6 this morning. It was still pretty dark, and I almost tripped over her. At first, I thought she was just sleeping or passed out drunk, but then I saw the blood and called. Did you see anyone else around? Hear anything unusual?" Sarah asked, her pen poised over her notebook. The jogger shook his head. "No, it was really quiet. Just the usual city noises. I didn't see anyone else." Monroe thanked the jogger and moved on to question the nearby food cart vendors who were setting up for the day. One vendor, an older man with a thick accent, mentioned seeing a shadowy figure leaving the park around the same time the body was discovered, but couldn't provide any more details. Back at the crime scene, the medical examiner had arrived and was examining the body. Monroe and Sarah watched as he worked, noting his observations. "Time of death is likely between midnight and 2 a.m., the examiner said. "Strangulation, as you suspected. No signs of sexual assault, but we'll know more after the autopsy." Monroe nodded, his mind already piecing together the information. A random killing in Central Park was unusual but not unheard of. The lack of ID suggested the victim might have been targeted specifically, but without more information, it was too early to draw conclusions. "Let's check missing persons reports," Monroe said to Sarah, "and see if we can get any CCTV footage from the surrounding areas. Someone must have seen something." As they wrapped up at the crime scene, Monroe couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. He had seen enough in his career to recognize the signs of a case that would haunt him, one that would demand every ounce of his skill and determination. The city around him seemed to hold its breath, as if anticipating the dark journey that lay ahead. With a final glance at the body, Monroe turned to Sarah. "Let's get to work." And so they began. Chapter 2. The pattern emerges. The wind howled through the narrow streets of the Bronx, carrying with it a biting chill that seeped into the bones. Detective Lucas Monroe stood in front of a modest brick apartment building, its facade aged and worn. The flashing lights of police cruisers and the low hum of conversations filled the air as officers worked to secure the scene. Monroe adjusted his leather jacket, the cold morning air biting at his face. His partner, Detective Sarah Mitchell, was already inside, speaking with the first responders. Monroe climbed the creaking steps to the second floor, passing by curious neighbors who peered through their doorways, faces etched with fear and curiosity. At the end of the dimly lit hallway, he found the apartment in question. The door stood ajar, marked with the familiar yellow police tape. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of decay and stale cigarettes. The living room was cluttered with old furniture and stacks of newspapers. It was clear the elderly woman who lived here had been alone for some time, surrounded by the remnants of a long life now extinguished. Monroe found Sarah in the bedroom, her expression grim. "Victim is Marjorie Thompson, 78 years old," Sarah said, glancing up from her notes. found by her home health aide who came in this morning. Monroe's eyes travelled to the bed where the frail body of Marjorie Thompson lay. The scene was eerily reminiscent of the first murder in Central Park. The same red line around her neck, the same signs of a struggle. Her lifeless eyes stared at the ceiling, and Monroe felt a pang of sorrow for the woman who had died alone and terrified. "Strangled," he murmured, more to himself than to Sarah. "Just like the girl in Central Park." Sarah nodded, her brow furrowing. "There's more. Look at this." She pointed to the nightstand, where a small, crumpled piece of paper lay. Monroe carefully picked it up with gloved hands, unfolding it to reveal a cryptic message scrawled in shaky handwriting. "The silence will end." "Another note," Monroe said, his mind racing. "We need to get this analysed, see if it matches the one from the park." The day had barely begun to fade into evening when Monroe received the call about the third murder. This time it was a high-rise office building in Midtown Manhattan. The victim was a middle-aged businesswoman found dead in her corner office. Monroe and Sarah arrived at the scene to find the building in a state of chaos, with employees gathered in small, frightened clusters, whispering and speculating. Monroe felt a sense of déjà vu as he entered the office, the scene all too familiar. The victim, identified as Lisa Carter, a high-ranking executive, lay slumped over her desk. The glass walls of her office provided a panoramic view of the city, now shrouded in the early evening darkness. Monroe's eyes immediately went to the telltale red mark around her neck. "Same method," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Strangled." Monroe walked around the desk, his eyes scanning the room. It was impeccably neat, everything in its place. But then he noticed a small piece of paper tucked under Lisa Carter's hand. He gently lifted her hand, retrieving the note. The message was identical to the one found at the previous scenes. "The silence will end." "This isn't random," Monroe said, his mind piecing together the fragments of a larger picture. "We're dealing with a serial killer." Back at the precinct, Monroe and Sarah laid out the evidence from all three murders. The photos of the victims stared back at them from the bulletin board: a young woman in Central Park, an elderly woman in her Bronx apartment, and a businesswoman in her Midtown office. Different ages, different walks of life, but the same method of killing and the same cryptic note left behind. "The killer is trying to send a message," Sarah said, her finger tracing the lines of the notes. "But what does it mean?" Monroe leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "The silence will end," he repeated, the words echoing in his mind. "Maybe the victims are connected in some way we haven't seen yet." They spent hours poring over the victims' backgrounds, looking for any link that might explain the killer's choice of targets. But there was nothing. No common acquaintances, no shared history. It was as if the killer had chosen them at random. The next morning, the story broke in the media. Headlines screamed about a serial killer on the loose, and the public's fear was palpable. Reporters swarmed the precinct, demanding answers. Monroe and Sarah were called into the captain's office for an urgent meeting. Captain Marquez was a stern woman in her 50s, with a no-nonsense attitude that had earned her respect and fear in equal measure. She looked at Monroe and Sarah with a mixture of frustration and concern. "We need to get ahead of this," she said, her tone sharp. "The media is already calling this guy the Silent Strangler. We need to find him before he kills again." "We're working on it, Captain," Monroe replied. "But the victims don't seem to have any connection. It's like he's choosing them at random." "Nothing is random," Marquez said firmly. "Find the pattern, find the killer." Monroe and Sarah redoubled their efforts, working around the clock. They interviewed friends and family of the victims, combed through hours of CCTV footage, and re-examined the crime scenes for any overlooked clues. The pressure was immense, and the fear of the city weighed heavily on their shoulders. One evening, as Monroe sat alone in his office, surrounded by files and photographs, he noticed something he hadn't seen before. The notes, the handwriting was shaky and uneven, but there was a pattern in the strokes, a familiarity that tugged at his memory. He called Sarah, who arrived within minutes, and they began analyzing the notes together. "Look at the way the letters are formed," Monroe said, pointing to the loops and angles. "It's almost as if the killer is left-handed, but trying to write with their right hand. Why would they do that?" Sarah asked, her eyes narrowing in concentration. "To disguise their handwriting," Monroe replied. "They want to send a message, but they don't want to be caught. They sent the notes to the lab for further analysis, hoping to find any trace of DNA or other evidence that could lead them to the killer. As they waited for results, the city seemed to hold its breath, the fear of the silent strangler looming over everyone. The second and third murders had confirmed Monroe's worst fears. They were dealing with a serial killer, methodical and elusive. The pressure from the media and the public added an urgent weight to their investigation, but Monroe remained determined. He knew that somewhere in the tangled web of evidence and cryptic notes lay the key to unlocking the killer's identity. As the autumn days grew shorter and the nights colder, Monroe felt the darkness closing in. But he also felt a spark of hope, a conviction that he was getting closer to the truth. The silence would end, one way or another, and when it did, he would be ready. The hunt for the silent strangler had only just begun. Chapter 3. The Suspects. Detective Lucas Monroe paced the length of the precinct's conference room, a sense of urgency propelling his steps. The walls were adorned with photos of the victims, a stark reminder of the killer's brutality. Each face represented a life cut short and a puzzle piece in a case that was growing increasingly complex. Monroe's partner, Detective Sarah Mitchell, sat at the long table, her eyes scanning the array of files spread before her. "We need to start connecting the dots," Monroe said, his voice edged with frustration. "We have 3 victims and no clear link between them." Sarah nodded, her focus unwavering. "Let's start with the people closest to the victims. There has to be something we're missing." Their first lead took them to the ex-husband of Lisa Carter, the businesswoman murdered in her high-rise office. James Carter was a man in his late 40s with a history of volatile behavior. His divorce from Lisa had been messy, marked by bitter arguments and accusations. Monroe and Sarah hoped to find a motive for murder. They arrived at James's apartment, a modest place in Queens. He answered the door, his face lined with stress and fatigue. "Detectives," he greeted them, his voice devoid of warmth. "What can I do for you?" "We need to ask you a few questions about your ex-wife, Lisa," Monroe said, his tone professional but firm. James nodded, stepping aside to let them in. They sat in his small living room, the tension palpable. "What do you want to know? Where were you on the night of her murder?" Sarah asked, her eyes locked on his. James ran a hand through his thinning hair. "I was at home, alone. Look, I know how this looks, but I didn't kill Lisa. We had our differences, but I moved on. I've been trying to get my life back on track." Monroe leaned forward, studying James's face for any sign of deceit. "Can anyone verify that? Neighbors, friends?" James shook his head. "No, I don't really know my neighbors, and I didn't have anyone over. But I'm telling you, I didn't do it. They left the apartment with no concrete evidence, only James's word. It was a weak alibi, but not enough to make an arrest. Next on their list was a neighbor of Marjorie Thompson, the elderly woman found in her Bronx apartment. The neighbor, Victor Ramos, had a reputation for being nosy and had a history of petty crimes. Monroe and Sarah found him at his ground-floor apartment, a place cluttered with odds and ends. Victor greeted them with a wary look. "Detectives, what brings you here?" "We're investigating the murder of Marjorie Thompson," Monroe said. "We understand you were her neighbor." Victor nodded, his eyes darting around nervously. "Yeah, I knew Marjorie. Sweet old lady. It's terrible what happened to her." "Were you home the night she was killed?" Sarah asked, her voice steady. Victor hesitated, shifting in his seat. "I was, but I didn't see or hear anything. I keep to myself mostly." Monroe exchanged a glance with Sarah. "Did you ever have any issues with Marjorie? Any disagreements?" Victor shook his head vehemently. "No, not at all. She was nice to me. Sometimes I'd help her with groceries or fixing stuff around the apartment." Despite his nervous demeanor, there was no clear indication that Victor was lying. They noted his statements, but left feeling that Victor was more a frightened man than a potential murderer. Their third suspect was a recently paroled criminal named Darius King. He had served time for assault and had been released a few months prior. His parole officer had flagged him as a person of interest due to his history of violence and his known presence in the areas where the murders had occurred. Monroe and Sarah tracked Darius down to a halfway house in Harlem. He was a tall, imposing figure with tattoos covering his arms and neck. He greeted them with a guarded expression. "Darius King?" Monroe asked, holding up his badge. "Yeah, that's me. What do you want?" Darius replied, his tone defensive. "We're investigating a series of murders, and we need to know your whereabouts on the nights of the killings," Sarah said, not mincing words. Darius's eyes narrowed. "You think I had something to do with that? I've been trying to keep my head down, stay out of trouble." "Can you account for your whereabouts?" Monroe pressed. Darius sighed, running a hand over his shaved head. "I was at the halfway house every night. You can ask the staff. They keep a pretty tight leash on us." They did just that, and the staff confirmed Darius's alibi. He had been present at the halfway house during the times of the murders, and there was no indication he had left. Frustration mounted as Monroe and Sarah faced a series of dead ends. Each suspect had seemed promising initially, but had ultimately led them nowhere. James Carter's weak alibi, Victor Ramos's nervous demeanor, and Darius King's criminal background had all turned out to be red herrings. "None of them fit perfectly," Monroe said, exasperated, as they reviewed their notes back at the precinct. "Maybe we're looking at this wrong," Sarah suggested. "What if the connection isn't between the victims themselves, but something else entirely?" Monroe nodded slowly, considering her words. "It's possible. We need to broaden our investigation, look for any patterns we might have missed." With their initial leads exhausted, Monroe and Sarah decided to delve deeper into the lives of the victims. They reviewed their social media accounts, financial records, and phone logs, searching for any overlap. They also revisited the crime scenes, looking for any small detail that might have been overlooked. At the same time, they reached out to the public for help, releasing a composite sketch of a potential suspect based on witness descriptions and CCTV footage. The media frenzy intensified and tips began to pour in, but most led to more dead ends. After days of relentless investigation, a small but significant breakthrough came when a forensic analyst discovered a partial fingerprint on one of the notes left by the killer. It wasn't a full print, but it was enough to run through the database. Monroe and Sarah waited anxiously as the analyst worked. When the results finally came back, their hearts sank. The print was inconclusive, belonging to no one in the criminal database. The investigation into the silent strangler was proving to be more challenging than Monroe and Sarah had anticipated. Despite their best efforts, the killer remained elusive, and the pressure from the media and the public continued to mount. Monroe stared at the board covered in photos and notes, feeling the weight of the unsolved case pressing down on him. He knew they were missing something, some crucial detail that would unlock the killer's identity. As the city braced for the possibility of another murder, Monroe and Sarah steeled themselves for the next phase of the investigation. They would not rest until the silent strangler was brought to justice. The hunt continued, and the stakes had never been higher. Chapter 4: The Psychological Profile. Detective Lucas Monroe walked down the sterile, brightly lit hallways of the NYPD headquarters, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Despite weeks of tireless investigation, the silent strangler remained at large. Monroe knew they needed a new perspective, someone who could look into the mind of the killer and offer insights that traditional police work might miss. That was why he had called in Dr. Emma Reynolds, a renowned forensic psychologist. Dr. Reynolds had a reputation for her sharp intellect and an almost uncanny ability to delve into the minds of criminals. She had worked on numerous high-profile cases, her expertise often proving pivotal in capturing elusive perpetrators. Monroe had met her a few times before, and he respected her analytical prowess and calm demeanor. He entered the conference room where Dr. Reynolds was already waiting, her appearance immaculate as always. She was in her mid-40s, with sharp features framed by shoulder-length auburn hair and piercing green eyes that seemed to see right through you. She wore a tailored suit, her posture exuding confidence and authority. "Detective Monroe," she greeted him with a nod, her voice smooth and composed. "It's good to see you again, though I wish it were under better circumstances." "Dr. Reynolds, thank you for coming on such short notice," Monroe replied, shaking her hand. "We're dealing with a particularly challenging case, and I believe your expertise could provide some much-needed insight." Sarah Mitchell joined them, and the three of them sat down around the conference table, which was covered with files, photographs, and notes from the investigation. Dr. Reynolds began reviewing the materials, her eyes scanning each document with meticulous care. "Based on the information you've provided," Dr. Reynolds began, "we can start to piece together a psychological profile of the killer. Let's look at the patterns and behaviors first." She pointed to the photos of the three victims on the board. "We have a young woman in Central Park, an elderly woman in the Bronx, and a businesswoman in Midtown. Different ages and backgrounds, yet the killer chose to strangle each one and left a cryptic note at each scene." Monroe and Sarah nodded, their attention focused on Dr. Reynolds as she continued. "The act of strangulation is significant," she explained. "It's a very personal, intimate method of killing. It suggests that the killer derives a sense of control and power from the act. They need to feel that they are directly taking the life from their victims." She paused, considering the notes left at each scene. The messages, "The silence will end," indicate a deep-seated psychological trauma. The killer feels silenced or oppressed in some way and is using these murders to make a statement to end their perceived silence. Dr. Reynolds leaned back, her expression thoughtful. This individual is likely highly intelligent and organized. The care with which they select their victims and leave no physical evidence suggests meticulous planning. They likely lead a double life, maintaining a facade of normalcy while harboring these dark impulses. Monroe scribbled notes, his mind racing to process the information. What about their personal history? What kind of background are we looking at? Given the method and the psychological indicators, we're probably dealing with someone who has experienced significant trauma, possibly from a young age. Dr. Reynolds responded. This trauma could have manifested as a deep sense of powerlessness or a need for control. They might have a history of abuse, neglect, or significant loss. Sarah chimed in, "Could this be someone with a professional background, given the intelligence and organization you mentioned?" "Absolutely," Dr. Reynolds agreed. "They could be someone who blends into society seamlessly. They may even have a job that affords them a sense of control or authority, masking their underlying pathology." As Dr. Reynolds spoke, Monroe couldn't help but feel a creeping sense of unease. The profile she described, intelligent, organized, experiencing deep psychological trauma, resonated with him in an unsettling way. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on the task at hand. "Let's talk about the notes again," Monroe said, steering the conversation back to the evidence. "What do you make of the wording? 'The silence will end'?" Dr. Reynolds looked at the notes thoughtfully. "The killer's choice of words is very deliberate. 'The silence will end' suggests that they feel their voice or their presence has been ignored or suppressed. These murders are their way of asserting themselves, of forcing the world to acknowledge them." Monroe felt a chill run down his spine. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain objective, but something about this case was getting under his skin. He shook off the feeling, determined not to let it cloud his judgment. Could the killer be trying to send a message to someone specific? Sarah asked. "It's possible," Dr. Reynolds replied, "but without more information, it's hard to say for certain. What we do know is that the killer is methodical and driven by a deep psychological need. This isn't about the victims themselves, it's about what they represent to the killer." Monroe leaned back in his chair, absorbing the information. "So, we're looking for someone with a history of trauma, who feels silenced, and who is highly intelligent and organized. They could be in a position of authority or control in their daily life." "Yes," Dr. Reynolds affirmed, "and it's crucial to understand that this individual will likely continue to kill until they feel their message has been fully communicated or until they are stopped. They are acting out of a compulsion, a need to reclaim a sense of power and voice." Monroe thanked Dr. Reynolds for her insights, knowing that this profile would be instrumental in guiding their investigation. As they walked her to the door, Monroe couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over him. Back in his office, he sat down at his desk, the weight of the case pressing heavily on him. He thought about his own life, the traumas and challenges he had faced. Was it possible that the parallels he saw were more than just coincidence? He dismissed the thought almost as soon as it formed, focusing instead on the task at hand. The consultation with Dr. Reynolds had provided Monroe and Sarah with a clearer picture of the silent strangler. They now had a detailed psychological profile to work with, offering a new direction for their investigation. The killer was intelligent, organized, and driven by deep psychological trauma, a profile that matched many potential suspects but would also help them narrow their search. As Monroe reviewed the profile, he couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. The killer's days of hiding in the shadows were numbered. They would use every resource at their disposal to find the silent strangler and bring him to justice. The silence would indeed end, and Monroe was determined to be the one to end it. The hunt continued, with new insights guiding their way. Monroe and Sarah knew they were getting closer, and they wouldn't stop until they had their suspect in custody. The city of New York was counting on them, and they would not let it down. Chapter 5. The fourth victim. The biting chill of winter was setting in as Detective Lucas Monroe navigated the familiar streets of his childhood neighborhood. Snowflakes drifted down, coating the city in a blanket of white, transforming the usual hustle and bustle into a muffled quiet. Lucas hadn't been back here in years. The memories it held were too potent, too painful. But the latest victim had brought him back, and this time the case had taken a deeply personal turn. He arrived at the crime scene, a small alleyway near the park where he used to play as a child. The scene was already cordoned off, and the air was thick with the low murmur of police radios and the occasional bark of orders. Monroe's heart sank as he approached the body, a figure covered by a tarp, surrounded by the telltale signs of forensic work. Sarah Mitchell was already there, her face pale and drawn. She glanced up as Monroe approached, her eyes filled with unspoken understanding and sorrow. "Lucas, she began, but Monroe held up a hand. "I know," he said quietly, his voice tight. He knelt beside the body, steeling himself before lifting the tarp. The face of the fourth victim was revealed, and Monroe's breath caught in his throat. It was Emma Wright, a childhood friend and one of the few people who had ever truly known him. They had lost touch over the years, but seeing her now, lifeless and cold, was a blow he hadn't been prepared for. Monroe stood up, his eyes scanning the scene with a mix of professional detachment and personal anguish. The method of the murder was the same: strangulation and a note left at the scene. But this time, there was something different. The note was pinned to Emma's coat, directly over her heart. Monroe carefully removed it, unfolding the paper with trembling hands. The message read, "I know you, Lucas." Sarah watched him, concern etched on her face. "Lucas, what does it mean?" "It means," Monroe said, his voice hardening with resolve, "that this is no longer just a hunt for a killer. This is personal. The location of the murder, so close to his old neighborhood, brought back a flood of memories. Monroe could almost hear the laughter of children playing, feel the warmth of summer days spent with friends, including Emma. She had been one of his closest confidants, someone who had stood by him through the hardest times. And now she was another victim of the silent strangler. As Monroe and Sarah worked through the scene, flashes of his past kept intruding into his thoughts. He remembered the first day he met Emma in elementary school, the way she had defended him against bullies, their shared dreams of escaping the neighborhood and making something of themselves. Her death here, so close to where they had grown up, felt like a cruel twist of fate. Monroe's mind wandered back to his childhood, to the small apartment where he had lived with his mother. His father had left when he was young, and it was Emma who had often been his anchor, keeping him grounded when the world seemed too heavy to bear. The neighborhood was full of ghosts, memories of a life that had shaped him into the man he was today. Returning here now, in the midst of such a brutal case, was almost too much to bear. Monroe knew he had to compartmentalize his emotions, to focus on the investigation if they were to catch the killer. He and Sarah went through the usual motions, canvassing the area, interviewing witnesses and gathering evidence. But this time, every step felt weighted with personal grief. At the precinct, Monroe and Sarah reviewed the case files again, looking for any connection they might have missed. The profile provided by Dr. Reynolds took on new significance. The killer was targeting people from different walks of life, but now it seemed they had also chosen someone from Monroe's own past. The message on the note suggested that the killer knew Monroe, knew his history, and was using it against him. As they sifted through the evidence, a new lead emerged. One of the witnesses had seen a man loitering near the park where Emma was found. His description was vague, but it was more than they had before. Monroe and Sarah followed up, tracing the man's movements through CCTV footage from nearby stores and traffic cameras. The footage revealed a man in his 30s, wearing a dark coat and a hat pulled low over his face. He had been seen near the park around the time of the murder, his behavior suspicious. Monroe felt a flicker of hope. This could be the break they needed. They tracked the man to a run-down apartment building not far from the park. With a sense of urgency, they obtained a warrant and prepared to make their move. Monroe's heart pounded as they approached the building, a mix of fear and determination driving him forward. They reached the apartment and knocked on the door, announcing themselves as police. There was no answer. Monroe motioned for the officers to breach the door, and they burst inside, weapons drawn. The apartment was small and cluttered, the air thick with the smell of stale cigarettes. Monroe and Sarah moved through the rooms, their eyes scanning for any sign of the suspect. They found him in the bedroom, a look of surprise and fear on his face. He was quickly subdued and taken into custody. Monroe felt a surge of relief, but knew that this was just the beginning. Back at the precinct, they interrogated the suspect, a man named Robert Lang. Lang had a history of minor offences, but nothing that indicated he was capable of murder. He denied any involvement in the killings, but under intense questioning, he revealed something that sent chills down Monroe's spine. "I don't know anything about the murders," Lang insisted, "but there was a guy a few weeks back. He paid me to watch the park, said he was looking for someone." "Who?" Monroe demanded, his patience wearing thin. Lang shrugged, his face pale. "I don't know his name, but he knew you, Detective. He showed me a picture, said he had a message for you." Monroe's mind raced. The killer was taunting him, using his past to send a message. The note on Emma's body, the location of the murder, it all made sense now. This was personal, and the killer was closer than he had ever imagined. As Monroe sat in his office, staring at the evidence board, he felt a new sense of resolve. The silent strangler had made a mistake by making this personal. Monroe would use every resource at his disposal, every ounce of his experience and determination, to bring this killer to justice. Emma's death had opened old wounds, but it had also reignited a fire within him. He wouldn't rest until the silent strangler was caught. The hunt was no longer just about justice for the victims. It was about confronting his own past and stopping a killer who had dared to challenge him on the most personal level. Monroe knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he was ready. The silent strangler had made a fatal error by underestimating him. And now Monroe was more determined than ever to end the reign of terror that had gripped his city and taken someone he cared about. The case had become a battle of wills, and Monroe was prepared to fight to the end. The killer's message was clear, but so was Monroe's. He would not be broken, and he would not stop until justice was served. The silent strangler's days were numbered, and Monroe was determined to be the one to end them. Chapter 6. The Breakthrough. Detective Lucas Monroe sat at his desk, surrounded by files and photos that chronicled the horrific murders of the silent strangler's victims. The latest victim, his childhood friend Emma Wright, had shaken him to his core, but it had also ignited a fierce determination within him. He knew they were on the brink of a breakthrough. Sarah Mitchell walked in, holding a report from the forensic lab. "Lucas, you need to see this," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. Monroe took the report and scanned it quickly. It detailed the analysis of the partial fingerprint found on one of the notes left by the killer. The print had finally yielded a match in the system, an old, abandoned warehouse in Brooklyn that had been linked to a series of unsolved crimes years ago. "The warehouse," Monroe muttered, his mind racing. "It's a long shot, but it might be the lead we've been waiting for." Sarah nodded. "It's worth checking out. If the killer has been using that place, we might find something that can finally give us a break in this case." The drive to the warehouse was tense, the cold winter wind howling outside the car. Monroe and Sarah arrived at the decrepit building, its windows shattered and walls covered in graffiti. The place had an air of desolation and abandonment, but also of secrets long buried. They approached cautiously, weapons drawn, and pushed open the heavy, rusted door. The interior was dimly lit by shafts of light streaming through the broken windows, casting eerie shadows on the floor. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay. Monroe led the way, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. They moved slowly, methodically, checking each room and corridor. It wasn't long before they found a door that seemed out of place. It was newer, sturdier than the others, and locked with a heavy padlock. "Here," Monroe said, motioning for Sarah to cover him as he picked the lock. The padlock clicked open, and they pushed the door ajar, revealing a hidden room. The hidden room was a stark contrast to the rest of the warehouse. It was meticulously organized, almost clinical in its cleanliness. Photographs lined the walls, images of the victims in life and in death. Monroe's heart sank as he recognized Emma's face among them, her bright smile forever captured in a moment of happiness. There were shelves filled with personal items, trinkets, jewelry, and other keepsakes taken from the victims. Each item was carefully labeled and displayed, a macabre collection that told the story of each life ended by the silent strangler. "God," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. This is sick." Monroe's eyes were drawn to a desk at the far end of the room. On it lay a journal, bound in worn leather. He opened it carefully, the pages filled with neat, precise handwriting. As he read the entries, a chilling realization dawned on him. The journal was a detailed account of the murders, written from the killer's perspective. Each entry described the planning, execution, and aftermath of the killings, offering a terrifying glimpse into the mind of the silent strangler. Monroe read aloud, his voice steady despite the horror of the words. "She walked through the park, unaware of my presence. I watched her for days, learning her routines, understanding her. When the moment came, it was perfect. The silence will end." The entries were interspersed with cryptic notes and symbols, some of which seemed to reference locations and dates. Monroe felt a chill as he realized that the killer had been planning these murders for years, each one a carefully orchestrated act. Sarah found a section of the journal that seemed to be directed at Monroe himself. The writing was different, more agitated, as if the killer's emotions had spilled over onto the page. "Lucas, do you remember me? Do you remember the games we played as children? The silence will end, and you will understand. You will see why this had to be done." Monroe's hands shook as he closed the journal. The killer knew him, had known him for a long time. The realization was both a revelation and a source of profound dread. Monroe and Sarah spent hours in the hidden room, cataloguing the evidence and trying to make sense of the cryptic entries in the journal. They found references to other potential victims, people who had been watched but not yet killed. There were also mentions of places significant to Monroe's past, hinting at a connection that went deeper than he had previously understood. Monroe's mind raced as he tried to piece together the fragments of the killer's psyche. The journal entries, the photographs, the personal items, they all pointed to someone who was deeply methodical and driven by a need to communicate a message. The killer's obsession with Monroe was clear, but the reasons behind it were still shrouded in mystery. As they prepared to leave, Monroe's eyes were drawn to a final section of the journal. It was written in a different ink, as if added later. The entry read, "The end is near. The final act is coming. Lucas, you will be there, and you will see. The silence will end." Monroe felt a surge of determination. The killer was planning something, and it was up to him and Sarah to stop it. The clues they had found in the warehouse were their best lead yet, and they couldn't afford to waste any time. Leaving the warehouse, Monroe felt a mixture of hope and dread. The discovery of the hidden room and the journal was a significant breakthrough in their investigation. They now had a clearer picture of the killer's mind, a detailed account of the murders, and a personal connection that could potentially lead them to the Silent Strangler. But with this breakthrough came new challenges. The killer was taunting Monroe, drawing him into a deadly game that had been years in the making. Monroe knew that the stakes were higher than ever, and he was determined to end this nightmare once and for all. As they drove back to the precinct, Monroe and Sarah began to strategize their next steps. They needed to analyze the journal entries, identify the locations and potential victims mentioned, and prepare for the killer's next move. The breakthrough they had achieved was just the beginning of a new phase in their investigation, one that would bring them closer to the truth and closer to confronting the Silent Strangler face to face. The hunt continued, but this time Monroe felt they were finally gaining ground. The silence would indeed end, and he was ready to ensure it happened. The killer had made it personal, and Monroe was prepared to see it through to the end, no matter what it took. Chapter 7: The Confrontation. Detective Lucas Monroe sat at his desk, staring blankly at the journal entries he had copied onto his tablet. The cryptic notes and meticulous details haunted him, particularly the sections that seemed directed at him personally. His concentration was repeatedly broken by strange visions, fragments of memories that didn't quite make sense. He rubbed his temples, trying to push through the fog in his mind. For the past few days, Monroe had been experiencing blackouts. They started as brief moments of disorientation, but had grown more frequent and longer in duration. Each time he awoke, he found himself somewhere unexpected. At his desk, in his car, or even in his own bed, without any memory of how he got there. The dreams that accompanied these blackouts were equally disturbing. Vivid, nightmarish scenes where he felt like both the hunter and the hunted. Sarah Mitchell, Monroe's partner, had noticed his increasingly erratic behavior. At first, she attributed it to the stress of the case, especially after the personal connection with Emma's murder. But as the days passed, her concern grew. Monroe was more withdrawn, his mood swinging from intense focus to sudden anger. She had seen him muttering to himself, lost in thought, and sometimes, when he looked at her, it was as if he didn't recognize her. One evening, as they reviewed the latest leads in the case, Sarah decided to confront him. "Lucas, we need to talk," she said, her voice firm but gentle. Monroe looked up, his eyes clouded with fatigue and confusion. "What is it, Sarah? I'm worried about you," she said, choosing her words carefully. "You've been acting strange, more than just stress. You're having blackouts, aren't you?" Monroe stiffened, a flash of anger crossing his face. "I'm fine, Sarah. We're both under a lot of pressure." "No, Lucas, it's more than that," she insisted. "You need to see a doctor. Something's not right." "I don't have time for that," Monroe snapped, slamming his fist on the desk. "We're so close to catching this bastard. I can't afford to be sidelined." Sarah took a step back, stunned by his outburst. "Lucas, please. We need to be at our best. If something's wrong, ignoring it won't help us catch the killer." Monroe's anger subsided, replaced by a deep weariness. He knew she was right, but the thought of dealing with his own issues felt overwhelming. I'll think about it," he said finally, though he had no intention of following through. As the night wore on, Monroe and Sarah continued their work in tense silence. Monroe's mind kept drifting back to his childhood, to moments he had long buried. Flashes of memory, his father's angry outbursts, his mother's tears, Emma's comforting presence, swirled in his head, overlapping with the haunting dreams he had been having. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through his head. He squeezed his eyes shut, gripping the edge of the desk. Images flooded his mind. A dark room, a woman's terrified face, his own hands tightening around her throat. Monroe gasped, the vision so real it left him breathless. "Lucas, what's wrong?" Sarah's voice cut through the haze, her hand on his shoulder. I don't know," he whispered, the pain subsiding but leaving a lingering dread. "I keep seeing things, memories, but not my own." "Are you sure?" Sarah asked, her concern deepening. "Maybe they are your memories, something you've repressed." Monroe shook his head, trying to clear the confusion. "No, it can't be. I would remember something like that." Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. She answered, her expression growing serious. "We've got a tip," she said, hanging up. "A potential new target. We need to move now." Monroe and Sarah hurried to their car, the tension between them momentarily set aside as they focused on the new lead. The tip had come from an informant who had overheard a conversation about a planned attack. The target, a young woman living alone in a nearby neighborhood. The drive was silent, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio. Monroe's mind raced, the recent memories and the looming threat of another murder intertwining in a chaotic swirl. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, determined to reach the woman in time. They arrived at the address, a modest apartment building on a quiet street. The lights were off, and there was no sign of movement. Monroe and Sarah exited the car, their senses heightened by the urgency of the situation. "Cover the back," Monroe instructed, drawing his gun. "I'll go through the front." Sarah nodded, disappearing around the corner as Monroe approached the front door. He knocked, then tried the handle. It was unlocked. He pushed the door open, the creak echoing through the silent apartment. "Police!" Monroe called out, stepping inside. The air was thick with the smell of stale food and neglect. He moved cautiously through the rooms, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. In the living room, he found the young woman, tied to a chair, her eyes wide with terror. Beside her stood a man, his face partially hidden by a hood. Monroe's heart pounded as he raised his gun. "Freeze! Drop the weapon!" The man turned slowly, a twisted smile on his face. "You're too late, Detective." Monroe's vision blurred, the room spinning around him. He struggled to stay focused, his grip on the gun tightening. "Let her go!" The man laughed, a chilling sound that sent shivers down Monroe's spine. "You still don't see it, do you? The silence will end, and you will understand." Before Monroe could react, the man lunged at him. They struggled, the gun slipping from Monroe's grasp. The young woman screamed, the sound piercing through the chaos. Monroe fought to regain control, his mind flashing with images of the past and the present colliding. As the fight continued, Monroe's suppressed memories began to resurface with startling clarity. He saw himself as a child, hiding from his father's rage. He remembered Emma's comforting words, her unwavering support. And he remembered the killer's voice, echoing in his mind, taunting him with each murder. Monroe pushed the man away, grabbing his gun from the floor. He aimed, his hands steady despite the turmoil inside. "It's over," he said, his voice cold and determined. The man laughed again, raising his hands in mock surrender. "You think you've won? This is only the beginning. The silence will end." At that moment, Sarah burst into the room, her gun drawn. She saw the man and immediately moved to secure the young woman, cutting the ropes that bound her. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, her voice gentle as she helped the woman stand. The woman nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you. He said he was going to kill me." Monroe kept his gun trained on the man, his mind still reeling from the memories that had resurfaced. "Who are you?" he demanded. The man smiled, a sinister glint in his eyes. You already know, Detective. Deep down, you've always known. The man was taken into custody, his identity still a mystery. But Monroe knew that this was far from over. The confrontation had brought to light suppressed memories and a connection to the killer that he couldn't yet fully comprehend. The journal, the cryptic messages, and the personal attacks all pointed to a deeper, more sinister plot. Back at the precinct, Monroe and Sarah debriefed, the tension between them easing as they focused on the task ahead. They had prevented another murder, but the killer's taunts and the resurfaced memories left Monroe with more questions than answers. As he sat in his office, the journal open before him, Monroe felt a renewed sense of determination. The killer was playing a twisted game, one that was intimately connected to his own past. Monroe was resolved to uncover the truth, no matter how painful or complex it might be. The breakthrough had led them to a critical juncture in the case, but the true confrontation was still to come. Monroe knew that he had to face his own demons to catch the silent strangler. The silence would end, and he would be there to see it through, no matter the cost. The race against time continued, and Monroe was ready for whatever lay ahead. The final confrontation was drawing near, and Monroe was prepared to confront the killer and the shadows of his own past. Chapter 8. The Revelation. The interrogation room was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the table where Detective Lucas Monroe sat opposite the surviving victim from the latest attack. The young woman, still visibly shaken from her ordeal, stared at him with wide eyes as Sarah Mitchell stood by, watching intently. "Can you tell us what happened?" Monroe asked gently, his voice a stark contrast to the tension in the room. The woman took a deep breath, her hands trembling. He came out of nowhere," she began, her voice shaky. "He was wearing a hood, and he had a knife. I tried to fight him off, but he was too strong. He said he knew me, that he had been watching me." Monroe listened, his heart sinking as he recognized the details of the attack. It was exactly as he had feared, exactly as he had experienced in his own blackouts. "We need to try something," Sarah said quietly, her eyes meeting Monroe's. "Hypnosis. It might help her recall more details." Monroe hesitated, his mind racing with the implications of what they were about to do. But he knew they had to try anything to uncover the truth. With the woman's consent, they began the hypnosis session. Monroe watched anxiously as she slipped into a trance-like state, her breathing slowing as she delved into her memories of the attack. "Can you see him?" Monroe asked, his voice soft but urgent. The woman nodded, her eyes closed. "Yes," she whispered. He's coming toward me. I can't move. I'm so scared." "Focus on his face," Sarah urged gently. "Try to remember." Suddenly, the woman's expression changed, her features contorting in fear. "It's him," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It's you." Monroe's heart stopped as the words echoed in the room. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's you," the woman repeated, her voice gaining strength. "You're the one who attacked me." Monroe felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. The realization crashed over him like a tidal wave, drowning him in disbelief and horror. He struggled to comprehend what he was hearing, what it meant. "No, that's not possible," he said, his voice hollow. "I would never." But the memories flooded back, vivid and unrelenting. The blackouts, the dreams, the flashes of violence, it all made sense now. He had been the killer all along, a hidden part of himself that he had denied and suppressed for years. Sarah's hand on his shoulder brought him back to the present. "Lucas, we need to talk," she said quietly, her eyes filled with compassion. As they left the interrogation room, Monroe's mind was in turmoil. How could he have been so blind, so oblivious to the truth? He had spent his life hunting monsters, only to discover that the greatest monster of all was lurking within him. But the twist came when they returned to the precinct, and the woman suddenly went into a trance-like state again. This time her voice changed, her features contorting as if possessed by some unseen force. "I know who you are," she said, her voice no longer her own. "I know what you've done." Monroe's blood ran cold as he realized what was happening. The woman was possessed, but not by some malevolent spirit, by the spirit of one of the killer's previous victims. Under the spirit's influence, the woman revealed the truth of the killings, the true identity of the Silent Strangler. It wasn't Monroe himself, but rather his alter ego, a manifestation of his traumatic past and repressed memories. Monroe listened in stunned silence as the spirit spoke through the woman, revealing details of the murders that only the killer could know. It was a chilling revelation, one that shattered Monroe's perception of himself and his reality. As the spirit's influence waned, Monroe was left grappling with the truth. He had spent his life chasing shadows, only to find that the greatest shadow of all was his own. As Monroe sat alone in his office, the weight of the truth bearing down on him, he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The revelation had shattered his world, leaving him adrift in a sea of uncertainty and self-doubt. But amidst the darkness, there was a glimmer of hope. With the truth finally revealed, Monroe could confront his demons head-on, confront the darkness that had lurked within him for so long. The road ahead would be long and fraught with danger, but Monroe was determined to see it through. The hunt for the Silent Strangler was far from over, but now Monroe knew that the greatest challenge lay not in catching the killer, but in confronting the darkness within himself. And as he gazed out into the night, the city lights twinkling like distant stars, Monroe knew that he was ready to face whatever lay ahead. The revelation had changed everything, but it had also given him the clarity he needed to finally find peace. Epilogue. Aftermath. In the aftermath of the revelation, Detective Lucas Monroe found himself teetering on the edge of a precipice, his mind fractured and his sense of self shattered. The truth of his alter ego, the Silent Strangler, had torn through the facade he had constructed, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. Sarah Mitchell, ever steadfast in her loyalty and friendship, stood by his side, guiding him through the darkness with unwavering support. She confronted him with the truth, forcing him to confront the demons that had long lurked within the recesses of his mind. But the weight of the truth proved too much for Monroe to bear. As the reality of his actions and the trauma of his past collided, he experienced a mental breakdown, his mind unraveling like a thread pulled too taut. Sarah took charge in the aftermath of Monroe's breakdown, ensuring that he received the help he so desperately needed. She arranged for him to undergo intensive therapy, guiding him through the process of confronting his trauma and reclaiming control over his mind. In the meantime, she worked tirelessly to close the case of the Silent Strangler, piecing together the evidence and tying up loose ends. Despite the turmoil and chaos that had consumed their lives, Sarah remained steadfast in her determination to see justice served. As the dust settled and the city began to heal, Sarah found herself reflecting on the nature of trauma and the human psyche. The case of the Silent Strangler had peeled back the layers of darkness that lurked beneath the surface of society, exposing the fragility of the human mind and the depths of human suffering. She pondered the complexities of criminal behavior, the tangled web of motivations and impulses that drove people to commit unspeakable acts. And she vowed to dedicate herself to understanding the deeper aspects of the human psyche, to unraveling the mysteries that lay hidden within the darkest corners of the human soul. In time, the city began to heal, its wounds slowly but surely closing as life returned to normalcy. Sarah, for her unwavering dedication and exemplary leadership during the investigation, was promoted to a position of authority within the NYPD. Her insights and expertise recognized and valued by her colleagues. But amidst the accolades and the celebrations, Sarah remained humble, her focus unwavering as she embarked on a new chapter in her career. She knew that the journey was far from over, that there were still mysteries to unravel and demons to confront. And as she looked to the future, she knew that she would carry the lessons of the past with her, that she would continue to fight for justice and understanding in a world plagued by darkness and uncertainty. The journey had been long and arduous, filled with pain and suffering, but through it all, Sarah had remained steadfast in her resolve. And as she gazed out into the horizon, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with courage and determination, secure in the knowledge that she was not alone. The end.
Thanks for tuning in to our podcast. If you enjoyed our exploration of ghosts, mythical creatures, and urban legends, please share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling episodes. Until next time, my beloved listeners.